Hey everybody, Jon Stewart here. We did an episode about the economy and we had on Amy Jo Hutchison, a phenomenal advocate for low-wage workers, and in fact, talks a little bit about her own experience with what it's like to be working poor in America.
One of the obstacles is you're choosing between organizing and pissing off your boss. And if you're in that gray space between not qualifying for SNAP and not making enough to get by,
right?
Like the real decision at the end of the day would come to, Amy Jo, are you gonna join this union and piss off your boss, or are you gonna feed your kids in the morning?
Anyway, I'm just gonna pass things to Amy Jo, and she can talk about maybe walking us through how inflation and some of the new economic programs are affecting a lot of the work that she's been doing. And so take it away, Amy Jo.
Hey, John. I'm so glad to be back. The more we could talk about this stuff, the more we're going to see it fixed, right? We're going to see it change. It's already rough out here, right? I'm from West Virginia, and we're one of the poorest states in the nation. We were paying almost $4 a gallon for gasoline, just as an example, which is pretty high here, right? Because we're not used to that. And one of the things that always strikes me is one of the pushbacks whenever we're talking about poverty and the working poor is, well, there are good jobs out here, good paying jobs out here. And so we equate $10, $50, $11 an hour with a good paying job around here, right? But whenever you're paying $4 a gallon for gasoline to get to that good paying job, it's like, 2, not quite 3 gallons of gasoline for every hour that you work. So I think if we just start talking about the situation with inflation, how hard things were before the prices went sky high, and now we see people who aren't able to buy the groceries that they're typically used to buying because they can't afford the prices. People are starting to have to make different life choices and different decisions because the pinch just gets a little harder. In times like this, you see an increased need for food pantries, right? And for charity help and for utility help. It's not getting any better out here. Most of the people that I speak with, if we can just hold steady, we feel like we're winning at this point. I worked so hard on that child tax credit legislation. Again, we have a problem here in America because we want to divide people by class. And so, how do you decide who's worthy and who isn't worthy? The child tax credit meant so much to me because I saw the difference it was making in people's lives. A part of poverty, a part of growing up as a kid in poverty, which, that's my lived experience, right? A part of that is just the lack of experiences that you're able to have because you can't afford them, right? Or because they're not accessible. And so when I would hear stories about little girls being able to be cheerleaders because their parents could afford the fees and the uniforms, or a little girl getting braces on her teeth because her mom could finally afford to have that done, right? We heard stories about people buying their firewood to heat their homes because the price of gas has been astronomical around here and the winters have been long and cold. So I got to hear just all of these little pieces that may seem insignificant to people who don't experience financial hardship. It's a lot different outlook on life whenever you can pay the bills and have food on the table and you don't have to worry about that, especially in a state like mine, right here in West Virginia. And so I spent a year and a half going around collecting stories from folks. How was the child tax credit affecting your life? The big one was they could go to the grocery store whenever they needed to. They didn't have to wait for the food stamps to drop. People were able to put gasoline in their car, and it wasn't such a struggle from payday to payday to be able to get back and forth. Just these small incremental changes. This child tax credit was meeting basic needs. We saw a decrease in homelessness here. We saw a decrease in the child abuse cases. The ER visits declined. This was really beneficial, and this was very healthy for families to have that extra boost if they chose to. That was the other part of it, right? You didn't have to take these payments. We talked to a member of Congress and the comment was made in the press about how people are just using the money for drugs. And it was at that moment where I was like, that's how they feel about people who don't fit the mold. I mean, we've always had these stereotypes about how poor people were unmotivated and that they're lazy, right? And they don't want anything. They want to sit and live their best life, getting a welfare check. It's so easy for people to push that narrative. Because if we have to really address that narrative, then we have to, why were people relying so heavily on this child tax credit in the first place, right? It's because we have so many needs that we're not able to meet. I don't think that we can speak enough about that. We have the stories that come from the opinion of, well, they're just using the money for drugs, whereas if you really take a minute to look, just the opposite of that was happening. We actually saw a decrease in that too. But those stories don't fit the narrative. They don't fit the narrative about how poor people are just wasteful and don't know how to budget their money. Again, we're talking about taxes and corporate tax cuts. We don't have a problem doing that, right? We'll support that. We'll vote for people who want to do that. But if it's for Amy Jo, who lives down the street, whose kids might want a second pair of shoes, right? Those are the things we have problems with. And so I just think it all comes down to just this mentality we have in this country of who's worthy and who gets to decide who's worthy. We love to be punitive here. Let's put work requirements on food assistance because everybody knows the way to get somebody to work is to keep them hungry. Like, who does that? Who thinks like that? People who have never experienced hunger think like that. It's because we treat poverty like it's a character defect here rather than just a circumstance. We don't want to talk about how the systems trap people there. To me, it just makes sense if we're going to have this whole pull yourself up by the bootstraps rhetoric, right, that is so strong here in America, right? How in the world can we keep on pretending that we don't have to have something in place so people can take care of their responsibilities and take care of their families? One of the things I'm always told about myself is get off your lazy ass and get a job. Stop having kids you can't afford. Well, wait a minute. Maybe if we had universal childcare, maybe if I could afford childcare, because here in West Virginia, it costs more for a private paid family and childcare a year than it does to go to WVU or Marshall University. That's whack. Right? It's twisted. I think it all comes back to being able to help people help themselves. Not only that, but then we also just had the stress not very long ago, the baby formula shortage. Like, holy crap, we're out here wondering, we can't even find a formula in the store to feed our kids to keep them alive. But if they have a poor parent, they probably just wouldn't make the right choice. So it all goes back to just the harmful rhetoric about poor people, where we want to blame the person instead of the systems that create them. It's also because we know from research and studies and God, just from paying attention, that Black and brown folks are directly impacted by these policies, right? Like the benefits in the Black and brown communities across America from that child tax credit expansion were astronomical. We have a system that is based on racism and white supremacy, right? And that's really uncomfortable for Americans to acknowledge and to understand. I don't think I would be doing my job or my people any justice by sitting here and saying that race doesn't have something to do with it. It absolutely has something to do with it. And your race absolutely has something to do with whether or not you're deemed worthy in this country. We feel uncomfortable. We don't like to feel uncomfortable in America. We're not raised to feel uncomfortable. I'm one of those people, right? So, it helped me out tremendously, just the stress, to be honest with you, the stress of knowing that some of that was knocked off. I say forgive it all, but that's just my opinion. I hear a lot of people push back on it because they had to pay their student loans or they had to pay their kids' student loans. And one of the overarching themes is like, who's worthy? We always seem to be in this, but I had to do it, so you should too. Well, if you can do that, great. But if you can't, how's it really going to affect you or hurt you if someone like my daughter doesn't have to carry that kind of a load into adulthood? I really do want to land on the fact that we are told, especially whenever you're poor, that the difference between being poor and not being poor in this country is a solid education. And so now we're into this phase of a bachelor's degree not really being enough. So then what is it? You have to have a master's degree to be able to get out of poverty with a better education. The message we're sending folks doesn't line up with the way that these systems work. And I think that's a huge part of the problem. It's easy for us to classify and judge everything as being a quote unquote handout. So I had to work really hard or I paid off my student loans. Well, I worked really hard too, and I've been carrying student loans since 1989. At times, there is such a bitterness there because we have historically had to struggle, right? Certain demographics of folks, certain areas, certain states, we have historically had to struggle in order to just keep up. And so I think it's really easy for that to turn into bitterness, and so it just becomes like this whole cultural, almost like an experience, right? Like a cultural norm for us to say, hey, you know what? I did it. And so there's no reason in the world I'm not accepting any excuse as to why you can't do it either. How different would things look here in America if we were like, you know what, help whoever needs to help, right? Like, let's just create a system of equity, whether that's the student loan system or whether that's the safety net system or whatever it is, because I don't want my kids and my grandkids to have my struggle. That's why I work so damn hard all the time. We may have different ways of getting there and different roads to travel to get to the end result, but we probably want pretty much the same things, right? We're talking about values. I want my kids to have a good education. I don't think that my kids should have to suffer or pay twice as much. I'm glad that people have succeeded. I call it poor mouthing. I'd never poor mouth anybody out of their success. But on the flip side of that, why do you want my kid to have to struggle the same way you struggle? Because in my opinion, my job as a mother, right, especially as a poor mother, is I've worked so damn hard so my kids wouldn't have to inherit this legacy. Right? What if we approach things in America like that? Why make people suffer just because we did? Why not just change it so everybody can just do better? We're not going to be able to improve our situation if we don't have a strong foundation to build off of. When you raise the bottom, the top floats.